Next, we're going to look at genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is the underpinning of biodiversity, and so we need to address that in order to conserve biodiversity. So the definition of genetic diversity is the diversity or variety of genes within a population or genes within a species. The more diversity that exist in the genetic material, the more likely a species will survive any environmental change, because somewhere within that population or that species, there may be organisms, individuals that exist that have the ability to survive whatever change has happened in their environment. Unfortunately, as the number of individuals of a species declines to a critical point, genetic diversity of the species also declines because there simply aren't enough individuals of that species. So we saw with the example of the North Atlantic cod, the numbers were reduced, and then it was very hard for the species to rebound even after they were no longer harvested because there was a limit to genetic diversity. Other examples include the right whale, which topped out in recent years at maybe 410 individuals of the North Atlantic right whale. Then those numbers, about 2 years ago, we didn't even have any calves born. Now they did have some this past season, but generally the number of species has reached such a critical point. And usually people say below 400 or maybe 300 individuals of a species is just such a critical point that the species will not survive because they won't have enough genetic diversity. So then what happens? You have a limited number of individuals, they start inbreeding, which means they're mating with others of similar genotypes, typically relatives, or maybe even more distant relatives, but still relatives. So it's the same reason you don't marry your cousin, because when individuals that are relatives breed together, that leads to offspring that are more likely to possess a harmful mutation, and therefore less likely to survive and reproduce. The example here in the book is a panther in Florida, and the panther numbers in Florida declined to about 25, maybe really low numbers. And so there was not enough of the species for it to survive, the Florida panthers to survive. But they found out that the panthers in Texas are actually the same species. So they were able to introduce individual panthers from Texas into Florida and thereby increase the genetic diversity in that population and leading at least to a stabilization of the population size. Now, we've been talking about declining biodiversity or variety of genes within wild populations. It's also been an issue for our crops and livestock. There have been global declines in the biodiversity or the diversity of genes, genetic diversity, I should say, the variety of genes within our livestock and crops. So think for a minute of a couple of things. First, how many different animals and birds do people, U.S. citizens, tend to eat? Not that many. Maybe beef, maybe sheep, maybe chicken, maybe pork. And for birds, maybe turkey and chicken, and a few quail and Cornish game hens, that kind of thing. But they say that overall, citizens of the United States eat 7 animals only and 4 birds, and also a very limited number of plants, plant varieties. And that means if anything happens to one of these plants, animals, including birds, then we have a big problem. In the 1970s, there was actually a fungus that killed half of our corn crops. And one of the reasons GMOs, genetically modified organisms, were introduced were to fight things like this, like fungus coming through. Unfortunately, that further decreases the genetic variety that exists. So if another type of fungus, for example, or bacteria came through, to which those limited GMO corn plants were not able to possess the genes to fight it off, then we could have an even greater decline, a greater outcome from having a corn loss for this reason. Also, when you consider animals, there are a few breeds of, let's say, cattle or even milk-producing cow. But there are fewer and fewer breeds. A breed is the same species, but a particular variety of it. And so, overall, there has been a decline of about 50% in the variety of breeds or subspecies, if you will, that exist. And for this reason, we have recently, in the last couple of decades, developed seed banks. And seed banks are places where the seeds of a wide variety of species, wide variety of genetic diversity within a species of food, plant, or animal, well, actually, no, just plant, are stored in these very cold locations. And there's one in Svalbard, Norway, and on the right here is an artist's rendition, and on the left is also an artist's rendition. And the seed bank is international, and it's built into a very cold side of a mountain. And the idea is, therefore, it doesn't need to rely on power for refrigeration. These seeds will be maintained at very low temperatures nationally. And the idea is if there is a fungus or bacteria or any type of condition which severely limits our number and variety of food crops available, then some of these seeds with other genetics may be able to be used to grow plants. Now, one of the challenges is that this is an international seed bank, which is a wonderful concept, but you can also see that it could potentially lead to international conflict if there was such a severe shortage that people needed to fight over access and rights to the seeds. So many seed banks are now being developed by individual countries. And there are also individuals who just grassroots folks, like folks at the Barnstable Library, collect what they call heritage seeds from varieties of things like apples. You know, you go into a grocery store, you might see 5 or 6 varieties, the same varieties of, Honeycrisp apples or Gala apples, but there are really hundreds and hundreds of varieties of apples. So one of the goals, same with tomatoes, for example. So one of the goals of these citizen initiatives is to maintain those seeds, grow those that biodiversity within a particular food crop. Okay. Now we are going to look at categories of endangerment. So here we're talking about wild organisms, and we are looking at 4 levels that don't use the same terminology as you might be familiar with. So first are extinct, where an extinct species is one where there are no more individuals of that species known to exist today. Threatened is what we would call endangered. Threatened means a species with a high risk of becoming extinct in the future. There are very few of them, or their ecosystem has been heavily damaged. Near threatened is the next step down, and that's a species that may very well become threatened in the future. And then there's least concern, species that are widespread and abundant in numbers. So now we're going to look at how those levels are impacting birds, mammals, and amphibians. So birds and mammals are both animals, but they have very different pie charts here. So the green is the least concern, and you can see that 80% of the bird species are not in trouble, with about 12% being in that threatened, or what we might call endangered, and then the 9% in what we might refer to as threatened, but would be considered near threatened. Mammals, a little less rosy picture. About 70% are in the least concerned area, but we still have 25%, or double the amount of birds. Mammals are 25% more endangered than birds. And then if you look at amphibians, almost half are either near threatened or threatened, and only half are of least concern. So let's think about some of the reasons this might be. One is that birds have the capacity to migrate. So if a food source, for example, becomes scarce, or if habitat is switched over from a natural forest to a human city, then they may be able to migrate, or they may be able to adapt. Maybe they once lived in an oak tree forest, but now they can live in a pine forest or a scrub pine forest on Cape Cod. So they have a little bit lower risk. However, as you know, the songbirds, for example, are an example of threatened species, and so they still do face some threats. Over here we have mammals. Now, why are mammals more susceptible to being in the threatened range? Well, there's several reasons. The larger mammals have a lower reproductive capacity. They are not necessarily producing, let's say, 3 little baby robins each season. They may not be producing 3 little human babies once a year. So mammals are more threatened. They also have less ability to adapt in other places. They can only migrate slowly, and they are dependent on more what species of plants are around or other animals that they might feed upon. So why amphibians being in such a difficult spot here? Well, with the amphibians, there are several reasons. And the first is that they lay their eggs in water. And they often start as larvae that live in the water and have gills, just like a fish does. And then as they mature, the gills convert over to lungs. So amphibians spend part of their life cycle in and on water and part of their life cycle on land. So that means that if there's any concern, such as a pollutant that's in water, and then another one that's on land, they're getting a double whammy there. The other problem for amphibians is their skin. Their skin is actually a secondary respiratory system. It helps them breathe. It's very, porous isn't the right word. It's, through the skin, toxins can be are more readily absorbed than they are for mammals. For mammals, for example, our skin is a very protective barrier, and that's not true of amphibians. So that is one of the reasons why they're more impacted. In many cases, too, amphibians may not have received the attention that a mammal being endangered would call up, and even birds. So amphibians may not be something that many people study or go bird watching for, or admire their cuteness, for example. So they may have been understudied as well and underprotected as well until recent years. Okay, so that is it, and the next screencast will go on to explaining the main causes of declining biodiversity. Why are birds, mammals, and amphibians all experiencing these declines?